بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا وحبيبنا محمد بن عبد الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Alhamdulillah, we are continuing with our lessons in the great text Akhlaq Adudiya by the great Imam Abdul bin Ahmad bin Abdul Ghaffar al-Iji al-Shirazi, and we are up to our 14th lesson in reading this text. Alhamdulillah. We are up to the section on the branches of hikmah, or what we can also term the causes or the necessary conditions of hikmah. Hikmah being defined as wisdom, which we have spoken about before, which is the virtue of the rational faculty of the human. With the human having three faculties: the rational faculty, the faculty of anger or the irascible faculty, and the faculty of appetite, which we term in the Arabic we have al-quwa al-nutqiyya, al-quwa al-aqliyya, and we also have al-quwa al-ghadabiyya and al-quwa al-shahwiyya. So these are the three faculties of the human, of the human soul, and out of that we're speaking about the faculty, the virtue of the faculty of the intellect, al-quwa al-nutqiyya, and the virtue of that faculty is hikmah, which is wisdom. And wisdom has a number of prerequisites, a number of necessary preconditions. And just to remind you of the definition of hikmah, we've spoken about it before. That is we call it al-kamal al-ilmi wal-amali, as in perfection in knowledge and perfection in action. There's two aspects to wisdom, because we know that the intellect is of two types. We have the speculative intellect as well as the practical intellect. The speculative intellect deals with matters which are not related to human action, such as matters of theology, matters related to God, or perhaps matters related to mathematics. These are not related to human action, at least not directly. But we also have part of the intellect, which is the practical intellect, which is what we think, what we deduce in order for us to act in the right way. That is another part of the intellect as well. And wisdom deals with both perfection in the the speculative intellect, and perfection in the practical intellect as well. Now back to the discussion on the prerequisites to wisdom, and we've spoken about 5 of them already. The first one being clarity of mind, right? So we need to have someone has to be have a particular habit, right? A particular habit, such their soul is able to extract the desired result without confusion. So this is speaking about a general condition about the intellect, where it is an intellect which is generally free from confusion. What are the sources of confusion? We've spoken about it before, such as the passions, whether it's a passion from the irascible faculty, whether it's anger, right? Or whether it's one of the diseases of the heart that come through the faculty of anger, right? That could be arrogance, it could be ujub, which is self-delusion, right? So there's particular diseases that come through, particular things that cause confusion to the mind that come through the faculty of anger. Then there's also particular confusions that come about from the faculty of appetite, whether it's greed, whether it's grief. Grief and greed are often connected together. We haven't spoken about that before, but that's coming on later in the book. So there are particular confusions that come about the faculties of anger and appetite within the soul. So for someone to have that initial virtue of clarity of mind, right, they have to be someone who has worked on their self, worked on their nafs, worked on these particular passions within their soul, such that it doesn't cause these confusions. So we've spoken about that before. And then we have the preconditions of good understanding, the preconditions of quick-wittedness. Right, this refers to proper movement of the mind. Right, and these things are protected through what? Through learning the science of logic. Right, whether we're speaking about definitions, whether we're speaking about syllogisms, what are valid definitions, what are invalid definitions, what are valid syllogisms, and things like that. So these are very important. Right, we need to know what are valid forms of reasoning, what are valid forms of thinking, such that we can make that progress towards being that person of wisdom. But once again, remember, when we're speaking about this science, when we're speaking about akhlaq, we're speaking about habits. So these are things that it's not something that's just once off, right? We're speaking about someone who has practiced and really applied themselves in with these particular actions of the mind, such that they become habitual, right? It becomes easy for them to do. And in the previous lesson, we spoke about excellence of intellection, right, which is the examination of things to an appropriate extent, right, not leaving things out and not including things which are not in there. One really good example, which is part of learning, when someone, part of you can say, part of thinking in the right way, right? Because one thing which is really important, oftentimes you don't think about it in this way, that part of good character, right? Part of good character is actually thinking rationally, right? So if someone is unable to think rationally, then good character is actually something which would be difficult for them to attain. And learning logic, learning logic is part of learning how to think in the right way. But what is you could say after that, even you could say usually the journey of learning how to think rationally in a distinctively Islamic way, doesn't come about through learning logic, but it usually comes about learning the first and foremost the personal obligations, right? Let's say you're learning aqidah, right? One of the first points that you will learn in aqidah is the concept of the universe, because when you are learning about God's existence, right? We infer that from the universe. We infer that the universe is something that had to come into existence and it didn't exist before, and or we could say, who was the being who brought it into existence? It was the necessary existent, who is Allah. But why am I bringing this up in this particular section on the excellence of intellection, which is to examine things as they are, right? Because usually when we're studying, let's say we go to science class in primary school, in high school, oftentimes the term universe, right? The universe is understood as what is observed, right? Whatever can be observed, whether it's through the microscope, whether it's through a telescope, right? That's the universe. But what's interesting is that that is not an exhaustive definition of the universe, because we know as Muslims, we have received revelation about this, that there is, there are things beyond the observable universe. There are things which are super rational or beyond the rational, in the sense that or maybe not super rational, but super sensible. It's beyond the sensible, such as the angels, such as the jinn, and the various levels of the heavens, right? So we actually, as Muslims, have to understand the universe as being everything other than Allah, right? Everything other than Allah, ma siwa Allah. This is actually the definition of the universe, according to a correct conception, based on what we know from what the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has has told us. So that's an example of excellence of intellection, right? Someone has a habit such that it becomes easy for them to examine things as they are, right? Not to include things which are not in there, right? Such as things that do not exist. We don't consider that as part of the universe, or imaginary, things, superstitious items. We don't include that into the conception of the universe. But also we don't exclude what is actually there in the universe, which are things that perhaps we cannot observe. So that's part of what we mean by learning how to think rationally. Learning how to think rationally in a distinctively Islamic way, and that comes about not only through the learning of logic, right, but through actually learning the Islamic sciences, beginning with the personal obligations, whether it's aqidah, right, whether it is fiqh. Another great example comes through fiqh, right? When you because fiqh is essentially about what is right and wrong, what you should do and what you shouldn't do, right? If you come down to it, if you think about it, that's that's essentially, to some extent, what fiqh is essentially all about. Now, okay, what is, okay, now let's ask the question: what is a distinctively Islamic way of thinking about our actions? And all of you know this already, because everyone knows about the legal rulings, right? What is the ruling of prayer? The ruling of prayer is, it's an obligation. It's fard. The ruling of the ruling of let's say something which is impermissible, such as lying, is haram, right? So the way a Muslim thinks about actions is intimately tied with these statements of, we know the legal rulings, from if we begin from what is obligatory, and then we have the emphasized sunnah, and then you have the recommended, and then you have the permissible, and then you have the disliked, and then you have the impermissible, right? The prohibited. So this is a very distinctively Islamic way of thinking. We don't think, for example, we could say, for example, this is good, as in this is good to do, or this is bad to do, right? We do say that, in the sense that when we say something is haram, or we've learned whether something is haram, that's a bad thing to do, right? But when we say something is, let's say, when we say something like for example, when we say prayer is obligatory, what we mean is that we say that prayer is good, right? Prayer is good to do. But that's not all we're saying. We're saying as well that if you do it, you will be rewarded in the next life, and you will earn God's pleasure. And to leave it, you'll be in God's, it's up to Allah to forgive you or not, right? If he wanted to, He could forgive you, and if He wanted to, He could punish you. So the Muslim way of thinking in terms of actions is that we always connect our actions. Any action that we do, it's always connected, not just whether it's right or wrong, but that right or wrong is intimately linked with the afterlife. So that is a distinctively Islamic way of thinking. So that's what we mean when you learn about aqidah, when you learn the science of fiqh, when you learn all of these various Islamic sciences, you learn to think in a distinctively Islamic way, which is this whole process of learning, it's essentially this process of character development, right? As in you are refining yourself, right? You are refining yourself, and part of refining yourself is refining your intellect, the way you think. And part of that, as we're speaking about here, is excellence of intellection. That was the fifth, which we spoke about last week as well, is is ease of learning, right? So not that, so the previous conditions that we spoke about, right, as in someone is free of these confusions from the passions, or someone's mind is able to make the right logical movements, the correct movements, and they don't fall into logical fallacies, they don't fall into logical traps. And also they're able to, as we mentioned, to think. For example, we brought up the examples of the universe. What is the universe, right? Everything other than Allah. We spoke about the concepts of good action versus bad action, and that is how does the Muslim think? They think about that not just in terms of, I suppose, this life, but it always has to be linked to the next life. So that's part of excellence of intellection, to examine it to an appropriate extent, not leave out the afterlife in the way we think about our everyday actions. And then suhulatul ta'allum, the ease of learning. What is that? Is that learning through a lot of practice and a lot of habituation, is that learning becomes easy, right? Because we know that when someone could be very good at understanding when they're reading material, when they're studying, but it could cause them a lot of heaviness. So another important precondition to wisdom is that learning becomes something easy, right? As in they're able to learn, but it happens with little effort. So this is the fifth precondition to wisdom, which we spoke about last week. And then finally we have the sixth and the seventh. These two we'll touch on today, and that is, the sixth is al-hifz, which is retention, and the seventh is al-dhukr, which is recall. So meanings, right? Meanings that you have retained. A virtue or a precondition of wisdom is that someone is very easily able to retain meanings that have been understood, but also very easily calling them to mind when needed. Now, here the ulama, when they speak about hifz, they're speaking about a specific form of memorization, a specific form of retention, and it's different. So unfortunately, memorization has gotten a bad rap in modern education, right? Memorization, unfortunately, has been equated with rote learning, right? Rote learning being learning without understanding, right? Which can happen, but we're not talking about that, right? But at the same time, rote learning has its place. Rote learning in the Islamic tradition has its place for children, because and this comes through an understanding of the development of the human soul, because understanding, which a lot of these preconditions that we've spoken about assume that the intellectual capacity of the child has been developed. It takes, obviously, intellectual development takes many years, and it goes on into the 20s, 30s, and even the 40s. But here we're speaking about as in the aql hasn't reached a particular state where it's beneficial for understanding to be taught in a formal schooling sense. So instead, in the early years, in the Islamic tradition, memorization is generally the approach. But we're not here, when we're speaking about memorization as a precondition to wisdom, we're not speaking about memorization. We're not speaking about memorization of let's say, of the Quran, memorization of things which are recited. That's an important part of memorization, but we're not speaking about that here. What are we speaking about? We're speaking about someone who has the virtue, who has this habit very easily when they've understood a concept, right? So it's about concepts. So when someone, let's say they've understood, the concept let's say a principle that exists in fiqh, for example, bringing it to, yeah, let's say it's a principle which is related to commercial transactions, right? So a principle that exists in commercial transactions is that if there is a level of information asymmetry or a level of jahala or ignorance, things which are unknown in the contract, then what happens? Then that then that contract is now what we call fasid. It's called corrupt, right? So that principle, requires a few concepts to be understood and memorized. Someone has to understand, okay, what is meant by a contract. Contracts in Islamic law, they're not written, they're voiced, right? So that's something. So they need to have some sort of understanding, and they need to memorize what is that meant by a contract. They need to memorize the concept of jahala or ignorance in conditions of a contract. They need to memorize what is meant by a corrupt contract. So that's what we mean when the ulama, they speak about hifz or retention. It's retention of concepts, right? Retention of concepts, and that is a required precondition to wisdom. Why is that? The way you can think about it is because if we've spoken about thinking before, the concept of fikr in these lessons, and we know that fikr, right? Fikr is about, or what we can define as, we'll call it thinking. It's when someone recognizes something that they do not know, right? Maybe someone says something. Yeah, maybe this exact situation that I've said. Someone hears the word sale contract, right? Sale contract, and then in their mind they're like, okay, what's a sale contract? So they've recognized something that they don't know. So now how do they then come to knowledge of that sale contract? They have to now go back into their mind, right, and relate it to concepts which they already know. And what are these things that they already know except the things that they've memorized? Right? So the whole process of learning, the whole process of thinking and coming to new knowledge, as described by the Muslim theologians, the Muslim logicians, the Muslim scholars, it's a process of going back to what already exists within the mind, and then producing new information, right? This is the general process of thinking as described by the ulama of logic. However, at the same time, right, this is a bit of a tangent. Knowledge that when the ulama speak about thinking from that perspective, they're only describing a norm, right? They're only describing what thinking is like usually, because essentially knowledge is created by Allah in our minds, right? So whether the process, so just like, it's quite interesting, just like how we've studied in Aqidah, when we touch fire burns us, but we know that Allah creates the burning, right? It's not the fire that burns us. So once again, when the ulama describe thinking, right, this whole process of recognizing that which you don't know, going back into your mind to discover things that you do know, and as a result produce new knowledge that matches that which you don't know, this is actually a norm, right? Because in the end, if Allah so willed, He could create knowledge in someone without them going through that whole process. But that's a separate discussion. But what are we speaking about? We're speaking about hifz, or retention, as a prerequisite or a necessary condition to wisdom. Yes, and how did we define retention or memorization? It is the grasping, right? Someone is retaining these concepts that they've understood. Now, as we know, as we usually do in class, when something is a virtue, right? When something is a virtue such as retention or memorization, then there's always going to be what we call the tafrit and the ifrat. What is the deficiency and the excess, right? So this is so when something in the science of akhlaq has been identified as a virtue, and in this case, what are we speaking about? We're all speaking about virtues. It's just that these virtues are necessary preconditions to wisdom. So hifz is also a virtue, right? Retention or memorization is also a virtue. But what is the deficiency, right? And this often happens, unfortunately, because we live in a world which is filled with sources of information, so we don't quite build this habit of memorization. So Imam Tashkubrizadeh, he says here, Bismillah, تفريطها الغفلة عن استثبات الصور التي ينتفع بها في المطلوب. Right? So let's say there are things that you don't know, things which are important for you to know. And in order for you to know that, you need to have memorized some particular things. So it makes sense. So the excess, so the deficiency in that person or in us, in that case, would be that they haven't memorized these important things which they had to memorize in order for them to reach that point of knowledge which they have deemed important, right? So, for example, someone needs to have knowledge on what is valid or invalid in their prayer, right? And then they've prayed, and then they're like, oh, they did something in their prayer, and then then they don't know whether their prayer is valid or invalid. But why don't they know? Because they do know that they actually studied it, right? And they do know that if they had actually memorized what they had studied, they would know. So this is a case of not memorizing enough, right? Not memorizing enough, such that they weren't able to come to that conclusion at that point in time whether their prayer was valid or invalid, right? So it's always related to, so the deficiency in memorization, right, is related to things that you have to know, right? So things which you don't have to know, then don't memorize that, right? Because that's actually the vice of excess in memorization. So he says here, إفراطها العناية بضبط أمور لا ينتفع بها أصلا. Right? So we don't want to be people who habituate ourselves to memorizing that which we don't need. But I think that's probably doesn't happen too often in usually, memorization takes effort. So people usually don't memorize that which they don't benefit from. But it is still there, as in just to remember that the virtue of memorization is a mean between two extremes. Okay, and finally we also have recall, right? Dhukr. This is where someone habituates their soul, right? Their rational intellect, such that they can call to mind what they've memorized very easily. This is another precondition, required condition to wisdom. And what is the vice of deficiency? فَلَهَا طَرَفَانِ, as in, once again we know that dhukr, recall, has two, it has the vice of deficiency and vice of excess. What is the vice of deficiency? النسيان المستلزم لإهمال ما يجب مراعاته من المهام. Right? So the vice of deficiency is forgetfulness, right? Forgetting. But how is it? How النسيان المستلزم لإهمال. So it's forgetfulness which is necessitated from, right? So it's forgetfulness which has resulted from neglect, right? And this makes sense, because in order for someone to maintain that that strength in recalling what they've memorized, neglect is what they need to stay away from, and such that they don't forget what they've memorized. And finally, the vice of excess, right? The vice of excess of recall is, he says here, إفراطها الاستعراض المقتضي بتضييع الأوقات فيما لا يعنيه من المدركات, right? To basically investigate and analyze matters that are just a waste of time, right? And that's interesting. How do you define that which is a waste of time and that which isn't a waste of time? Well, the human has a purpose, right? Everything, this is one of the hugest blessings of of the Deen of Islam, is that it gives us a purpose. Because it's only through, this is one of the most fascinating discussions in moral philosophy, is that one of the most, in that the purpose of the human, right, is that even the concepts of good and bad, these very basic concepts of good and bad, are very much tied to the concepts of purpose, right? I'll very briefly mention something. For example, a watch, for example. How do you know whether a watch is good or bad, right? How do you know whether you've got a good watch, whether you've got a bad watch? Well, a good watch is a watch that allows you to tell the time. It tells you actually what time it is. Because a watch that doesn't tell you the time, it's a bad watch, right? And a watch is also good if it's not too heavy, like you can actually carry it around. Why? Because the purpose of a watch is that it should be able to tell you the time, and you should be able to bring it with you, right? So there's a purpose behind the watch. And a good watch is a watch that is able to fulfill that purpose. So likewise with the human, we know we have a purpose, right? And purpose. The purpose of the human is, this is a very, very we can say multi-layered discussion, and we know from the verse in the Quran that the purpose of the human is to worship, is to worship Allah. But at the same time, right, there is a purpose to that worship, which is knowledge of Allah, right? Deep certainty and knowledge of Allah. And other ulama within the science of akhlaq as well, they mention other purposes of the human, which is, for example, al-khilafah, which is vicegerency, which necessitates noble character. So it's a very fascinating discussion. But why did I mention that? Because we don't want to be memorizing things that don't benefit us, which don't bring us closer towards our purpose. So insha'Allah ta'ala, we will end our lesson with that, where today we covered the 6th and 7th, the final as well, preconditions to wisdom, right? We said the 6th precondition is retention, hifz, having the virtue of memorizing concepts understood. And the 7th is the virtue of recall, al-dhukr, namely calling to mind of what has been retained. And to have this at the level of a virtue, which is to have this such that these things come very easily to us, and that is done through habituation. So we'll end here. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.